you wish it.
You said she's actually going to be speaking. Well, it's certainly wonderful to be back here. I have a couple of good friends who just... I was just asked by this gentleman about a New York Times op-ed that I wrote recently about the SARS virus and also the legacy of medical discrimination against Chinese Americans. And he wanted me to discuss it very briefly. Essentially, when I was on the book tour, the New York Times asked me to comment on the fears of SARS. And I was very alarmed by what was happening actually at UC Berkeley, because there had been a wholesale ban of summer students from 4 Asian regions, the mainland China, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Even if they didn't have any signs of SARS, they just wouldn't be permitted to attend these summer classes. And then after a lot of controversy, Berkeley actually kind of revised its policy and allowed maybe a small portion of those students to come and enroll, but also announced that there would be special rooms to quarantine them, and they would be closely monitored by campus health authorities. And then, after, I think this only generated more anger, and eventually, they just reversed themselves completely. Now they're back to the pre-SARS policy. One thing that did disturb me about the Berkeley position was that it banned students on the basis of nationality rather than using an actual medical system or diagnosis to screen out students. And I also noticed, too, that students from Canada were not part of this ban, even though there had been several deaths in Toronto. So the New York Times article discusses the Berkeley situation, but also went into great depth about how the Chinese often had been singled out as being seen as more diseased or filthy by the medical community. And I gave plenty of examples, just like ranging from, the American Medical Association's announcement back in the 19th century that the Chinese were spreading a special Chinese strain of syphilis in the country, and they kept saying this even though they authorized studies that could not find any proof to back this up. And also, my article mentioned how when there were some reports of bubonic plague in Hawaii and also in San Francisco around the turn of the century, the health authorities targeted the Chinatowns, even though white people had been affected by plague as well. And they burned down parts of Honolulu Chinatown. They almost destroyed all of San Francisco Chinatown had not the community mobilized to save it. So I just think it's important for people to when trying to defend ourselves from this terrible virus, to really apply a system rather than just to kind of apply these knee-jerk reactions. So all throughout my book tour, I met couples who were hoping to adopt babies from China. And unfortunately, China has suspended its international adoptions program, and there's a lot of heartbroken couples out there right now because they've already seen some pictures of the babies that they would have from China, and now they're stuck in limbo. What's interesting is usually affirmative action kind of frames the debate in terms of maybe Chinese or other Asian Americans maybe taking away slots from people of other colors, like African Americans or Hispanic Americans, or vice versa. But what's really interesting is rarely is the debate framed in terms of white affirmative action. That is, the special legacy programs that exist at our leading university, the fact that some of the people at the top levels of our government, without mentioning any names, I think you know who I'm referring to, have often benefited greatly from like the Old Boys Network and legacy programs, and they have benefited because of their background and the color of their skin rather than their academic credentials. So any kind of discussion on affirmative action cannot begin until we're looking at white affirmative action as well as just affirmative action for other groups. That's my position on it. Yes. The one-child policy is going to have very interesting social repercussions, I think, for the nation of China in the next few decades, because essentially we have now, a nation of only children, and this means that, millions of children are growing up with, like the undivided attention of their parents, and they've often had almost unlimited resources to foster their education. Often the parents will devote all of their salaries to gratify their children's every whim, which could be in many ways a good thing because it may lead to an intellectual and artistic renaissance within China. I'm sure that we'll see many more many Nobel laureates and prodigies coming out of China. But at the same time, there may also be a great sense of entitlement that each one of these children have, and it may actually be a destabilizing factor. It would be interesting to see how they're going to work together as a team. And at the same time, too, because of the one-child policy, there is a lopsided sex ratio now because many baby girls were aborted or were simply abandoned in orphanages. Some of these babies have been adopted, but many others have perished in some of these horribly understaffed orphanages. So what that means is that there will be many Chinese men who will never find a wife, and that could be a very, very dangerous situation when you don't have like the stabilizing forces of family that raises this possible specter of Chinese men, forming gangs, roaming through the countryside, and kind of lurching the country into civil unrest. So it's interesting. I feel like there's a great deal of potential China now has for both achievement and also chaos. And like anything else, it's impossible to predict what will happen in the future. Well, there's a cultural that's from the cultural legacy of China that for many years kind of the system was patriarchal. In fact, that kind of encouraged people to have as large families as possible because the patriarch would be almost like a little emperor in his own household. And in the past, when China was much more an agricultural society, I think physical labor was valued. So Chinese men were valued over Chinese women, and also women were valued mainly for their reproductive, I think, abilities and their ability to bear sons. So and also men were considered preferable because they would carry on the family line. So that's why there was always a bias towards men in Chinese society. Of course, China is not unique in having this heritage, but it because of the social engineering with one-child policy has now resulted in a real massive shortage of Chinese girls, which may mean that there will be more respect for Chinese women there. But it's hard to say what will happen. They say that whenever there's a shortage, typically in societies, whenever there is a shortage of men and there's a surplus of women, that society becomes promiscuous and polygamous. And so women end up having to share men. But on the other hand, if there's a shortage of women and a surplus of men, society starts becoming very conservative, and women will end up marrying at younger and younger ages. And society's a lot less tolerant of women apparently sharing men. And it actually, because they're outnumbered, they actually might have fewer rights than before. Well, I feel like I've always adopted a much more inclusive view. I know the reality exists, but I've never really taken it, I think, personally, because I realize a lot of this may come more out of ignorance than malevolence. When I was growing up, I grew up in a very multi-ethnic academic community that was Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, the seat of the University of Illinois at Urbana. And so the interesting thing is that as a child, the reality I lived with was that professors were working together across color lines and marrying each other, and that there were many of my classmates were the products of interracial marriage. And so I know that people are capable of working together and without having to have their relationships destroyed by like racial tensions. However, I was also disturbed to see the racial stereotypes in the media. And so it was almost like on the outskirts of my world, I realized that there was still a lot of prejudice out there. But at the time, I almost felt it was the media that was maybe the anomaly, and my experience was more typical. Now I realize it's probably just the reverse. But one thing that I do want to point out to all of you is that I don't think that often the exotic or the foreign, how shall I put it, I don't think that the differences in skin color alone is often what's enough to spawn racial violence. Usually another factor is needed, such as an economic or political crisis. And it's when I looked at the history of the Chinese in this country, I see how that at certain times they were really greatly accepted, and other times they were vilified and even killed. And I began to realize that it had to do more with just the fact that they looked different. And this has made me frame the whole racial issue in the larger context of human rights. And I'm always constantly drawing comparisons between the Chinese American experience and that of other ethnic groups worldwide. And just to give you an example of two people who probably should have received a lot of discrimination in their region but did not, because the economic and political factor was not in place, was the story of Chang and Bunker. They were the famous Siamese twins who shared a liver and a 5-inch ligament of flesh. Now, I don't think there's any two people who look more freakish than that. And they toured the world as celebrities and then decided to settle down in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, which is one of the most racist regions of the country. But since the Chinese were not seen as an economic threat in those regions, they didn't have any problems winning acceptance there. They married 2 white women. They were sisters. They fathered 21 children between them. And they also started their own plantation, complete with 33 black slaves. In fact, they were so much part of the community that with the outbreak of the Civil War, their 2 eldest sons enlisted in the Confederate Army. So, I mean, ironically, some of the worst racism against the Chinese existed in places where the Chinese, clustered in the greatest numbers, because often once they posed a huge economic threat, that's when often the racial tensions would escalate. And so, the exclusion laws that are described in my book came out as a result of the economic depression of the 1870s. And you'll see the worst backlashes against the Chinese are always tied to something that's more than just the fact that they look different, they're a minority. Like the backlash of the Chinese experienced during the McCarthy era also grew out of the fact that China had fallen to the communists and that we were afraid of the communist threat. I think, in fact, some of these more recent problems that the Chinese American community has had, especially with the Wen Ho Li crisis, has to do with the demise of the Soviet Union and the fact that China is now the second greatest superpower in the world. So I think we just have to be really attentive of all this and not ever really take these racial problems, personally, but to see it in a larger context.
Iris,
yes.
Can you say something about the work of Him-Mark Lai?
Yes, actually, Him-Mark Lai is one of the is actually known as like the godfather of Chinese American history. He actually produced some of the earliest scholarly works on the subject. And in fact, his work is quoted extensively in my book as well. I owe him a great debt of gratitude. He's in the acknowledgments of the book. I also had the pleasure of speaking with him on many occasions. Yeah, actually, the Chinese have now kind of earned the reputation for being model minorities, I think largely as a result of some of the more recent waves of immigration and the nature of the waves themselves. Many of the Chinese who came during the 1960s were actually supported by the U.S. government in the fields of science and technology during the Cold War, when the U.S. was dumping billions of dollars into research and development. Many Chinese immigrants found the technical field, science, technology, medicine, as their path to success. And so, the need that our country had for immigrant brain power kind of drew often the best and the brightest, and also the fact that a lot of intellectuals were left without a home thanks to the communist revolution also assisted in this kind of immigration. And that's why you often see these immigrants and also their children doing so well, often in the most prestigious universities. And this is, I think, the reason why we have the image of the Chinese as model minorities. But it's an image that a lot of people are having problems with too, because it also kind of implies that they're very docile and they just follow the rules. And one thing that I think the Chinese American community, like any other ethnic group, has to confront is that they have to speak out and often challenge the government and the status quo if there are assaults on the civil liberties of Americans. And the one thing that astonished me as I wrote this book was the degree to which the early Chinese were politically active and really never followed that mold of the model minority. In fact, some of the their early litigation really formed the foundation of civil rights law. Like Yick Wo versus Hopkins, for example, helped establish the concept of equal protection before the law. The landmark case Wong Kim Ark versus U.S. helped protect the concept of birthright citizenship in this country, which is a very important ruling. So so time and again they were extremely litigious. I was shocked to see just how active they really were. In reference to the Chinese Americans, I think actually I feel the heat was on Chinese Americans during the Wen Ho Lee crisis and also during the Cox report on alleged Chinese espionage. But suddenly the emphasis shifted on the Middle East and also the Muslim American community because of the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So one thing I want to say is I don't know what the real state of discrimination is, but it does occur in cycles, and it's just really, I think, chilling to see what the Muslim American community is undergoing right now. It's almost like something that is right out of the pages of my book, what some of the Chinese Americans had experienced at various times in their 150-year history. Well, I don't think we're moving in the right direction. In fact, what's very frightening to me is that officials are now evoking some of the most shameful and disgraceful legislation from the past to try to justify present policies in the name of security. Thank you. And for example, a few months ago, Howard Coble, he's I think head of a subcommittee on Homeland Security. He actually was trying to defend the imprisonment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps during the 1940s. And there was a quote that he made just that really shocked the Asian American community. He said some of these Japanese Americans were probably intent on doing harm to us, just as some of these Arab Americans are probably intent on doing harm to us. So, I mean, I am very alarmed at what he's alluding to and the direction that this country is headed towards. The question has been, are there any attempts to make a feature film, a Hollywood film, based on my second book, The Rape of Nanking? And over the years, I have been approached by major producers on the subject. But what's interesting is that I think the presence of Sony actually in Hollywood is a very dangerous. Right, there is no Chinese American owned studio. You see, what's really disturbing is that when you have a film, what's more important than I think even raising money for film is to get distribution for that film. But there have been enough people who have contacted me that I'm convinced that the talent is there, the capital is there, and the passion is there. But for any, if there are individuals who are very much interested in investing in such a project, I do urge them to contact me immediately because I do think it's an extremely important project. It must be supported, but it also has to be done very carefully. I mean, there had been at various times, I think, proposals and offers to buy out movie rights from individuals who are later, I found, connected to, Japanese corporations. So I think it's an important thing to be extremely careful. I mean, just to give you an example, there was a film called Return from the River Kwai, which describes the Japanese atrocities against POWs in the building of the bridge over the River Kwai. The producer is Kurt Unger, who lives in England. And unfortunately, his movie, which was to be distributed by Columbia TriStar, was scheduled for release shortly around the same time when Sony acquired Columbia TriStar, and his film has never seen the light of day since. And there was a lot of litigation surrounding it, and in fact, I think Sony actually sued him, claiming that he had infringed upon a copyright of the title of Bridge Over the River Kwai, and claimed that they had been sued by, the estate of Sammy Siegel, that had the screenwriter of that movie. But then he found out that could not have happened for two reasons. One, you can't copyright a name. River Kwai is an actual place, so that means the filmmakers of New York cannot sue the filmmakers of Escape from New York, for example. But secondly, and more importantly, they found out that the estate of Sammy Siegel could not have possibly have sued Sony because they had bought the rights to the film a long time ago. So it was awful. I mean, according to Kurt Unger too, that he found out later attorneys were accepting money from Sony, so then he had to sue his own attorneys. And that's just, the full details of this you could probably get from the press or from contacting him. But it's very important that such a project be handled carefully, and it would have to be, I think, very much supported by investors who believe passionately in revealing the truth of the rape of Nanking. And I believe from the bottom of my heart that eventually such a film will be made, but it's going to be an uphill struggle. There have been several films already on the rape of Nanking in mainland China, but it's really disturbing that to this day there hasn't been a feature film on the rape of Nanking or many other episodes of the Sino-Japanese War, when you consider there are so many movies, important movies on the European aspect of World War II. So, but I'm confident that's going to change one day. But anyway, if you do have friends or contacts within Hollywood or people who are capable of investing, I think you should spread the word and have them contact me. There have been several books on the Nanking Massacre in Chinese, and there's some in other languages as well. So the answer is yes. There had just not been one that had been easily accessible in the English language until my book came out. But the information was always there. I mean, when I did the research for the rape of Nanking, I unearthed primary source documents on the subject in 4 different languages: German, English, Japanese, and Chinese, like in terms of government reports and diaries, war crimes tribunals, transcripts. And it was always there, available to the public, but somebody had to dig for it. And there had been some scholarly books, mostly I think in Chinese, but they weren't very well known, definitely, to the world public.
Did your book wind up getting translated?
Yes, it was translated in actually both Chinese, simplified and complex Chinese characters. Typically, what happens is that if your book is popular enough in Asia, there will be 2 Chinese editions, a PRC and an ROC edition. So like a Taiwanese publisher put out the complex Chinese character edition, and then the PRC house put out like a simplified Chinese character edition. Yes. The story of what I encountered there could fill a book in itself. The Kashiwa Shobo Publishing House had entered into a contract with Basic Books to release a Japanese language edition of the book. And unfortunately, it's a very long story, they ended up canceling the contract. And according to the Japanese media, and I don't know the details of this because I was not part of what was really happening in Japan, they received threats, death threats. So there was an article in the New York Times that I think that describes the situation in detail, but it was pretty appalling what had happened. Japan has yet to deliver an official, unequivocal apology to its wartime victims, nor have they paid reparations. Not only to their Chinese victims, but also to victims, in the United States. I think, of course, we always have to make a distinction between Japanese foreign nationals and Japanese Americans, which unfortunately our government did not do during World War II. And I would say that some people might identify themselves as Chinese American or Japanese American. Some might see themselves as Asian American, and I think that the comfort level between Asian Americans of different heritages is actually something. There's no problem really at all, nor should there be. I think because the important thing is to focus on the human, the larger human rights context of what happened, and I don't think Americans of any ethnicity should be seen as responsible for the crimes that were committed, years ago by the country of their, by their ancestral homeland. But what is important is that I think that the government of the country that did commit these atrocities should separate themselves from the past by at least acknowledging what has transpired. Unfortunately, the Japanese government to this day, they whitewash the accounts of these atrocities from their school textbooks. It's so different from what the nation of Germany has done. Germany has paid billions in reparations. They've made profuse apologies, and they've also made it illegal for schools not to teach the history of the Holocaust. In Japan, not only have they not paid reparations or apologized, we've got, the Ministry of Education refusing to, actually even permit the use of these textbooks that depict what really happened. There was a Japanese scholar who's been, unfortunately he's passed away, but he spent his life fighting the Japanese government on this issue. And also, the Prime Minister of Japan has gone to pay visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, which, worships Class A war criminals in Japan as if, that they're gods. The moral equivalent is like the head of state in Germany going to the biggest cathedral of Berlin, where they've moved busts and statues of Hitler and his cronies and worshiping them as deities. It's absolutely astounding when you consider the differences in how the two countries have assessed their wartime crimes. Thank you so much for coming here today. I encourage you, all of you, thank you. Since there are, often cutbacks in libraries, to often buy a copy for your local public library, because especially like a high school or grade school library, because that's often where children would be able to research the history of American ethnic groups on their own, and this is where a lot of the stereotypes start. Thank you. Two on this. Right. Collectors usually just want the date and the.
I always want the date.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. 3227.